There is a kind of dual tragedy when it comes to situating thinkers in Western esotericism into the larger scope of intellectual history. The most egregious failure, in my opinion, is simply that of academic philosophy just failing to even include such thinkers in what we might call the Western canon at all. I would dare say that academic philosophy is just simply bigoted against such figures, but the truth of the matter is that mainstream, at least academic philosophy, isn't actually educated enough about these figures to even be biased against them in the first place. They're just sidelined through institutional ignorance and, well, just ignoring them. You'd perhaps be shocked to learn that I got a PhD in philosophy and never once was a class even offered on Neoplatonism or medieval philosophy. All of it, for that matter. Much less a survey of occult philosophy, not even possible, despite the profound effect such philosophy has had on Western intellectual, but also, of course, our spiritual history as well. But aside from this failure, another, and again, much more reasonable mistake also gets made, in my opinion. Understandably, most people coming to thinkers in the occult tradition, they're not coming there as part of a history of the study of philosophy, but for practical, spiritual reasons. Further, because these thinkers basically aren't taught in philosophy or religious studies classes in an academic setting or basically any setting, most folks come to them either as hyper-specialists in those specific types of occult philosophy or as autodidacts, and there are both attendant limitations in both respects. And thus, while Agrippa or John Dee are the focus of serious study, their place in the larger arc of intellectual and spiritual history is often just missed from this specifically practical angle. And again, that's a far more forgivable and far more reasonable kind of intellectual mistake, I suppose, than, the wholesale ignoring it in academic philosophy. Thus, occult philosophy just sort of languishes away, fundamentally underappreciated precisely as philosophy, especially philosophy within the larger framework of the history of philosophy itself. And that's why I try to create content on this channel that highlights occult philosophers and their contributions to the history of philosophy more generally. They deserve to be respected as philosophers as much as occultists. So with that in mind, I want to turn to how Renaissance and early modern occult philosophy profoundly challenged nominalism, the dominant metaphysical paradigm of that day, through the rebirth of metaphysical categorical realism in both Hermetic and occult philosophy. Now, if those terms aren't totally clear to you what they mean, just stick around, we'll make it more clear later, hopefully. Make sure to subscribe for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history, and if you'd like to support the work of providing accessible, evidence-backed, and free content on topics like this, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at my Patreon or checking out the merch that we have at the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism, make sure to check out my study guide, which helps to situate you within the broader field and give you accessible and reliable text for the study of the occult. And if you're interested in historical books, actual antiquarian volumes in the occult and the mystical, check out my bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to how Renaissance realism challenged the dominant scholastic philosophy of nominalism, leading a kind of metaphysical realist insurrection, a realist revolution. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. To frame out this important moment in philosophical history, we have to rewind all the way back to where a great many, perhaps all, Western philosophical problems emerged. The positions of Plato and Aristotle. Those guys. And in this case, in what we call the problem of universals. Language and logic, especially categorical logics like that developed famously by Aristotle, often function by relating particulars to universal categories. just think of the major and minor terms in a syllogism. For instance, when I say something like Socrates is a human or 3 is a number, I'm locating the particular Socrates and the particular number 3 within the larger category of both humans and numbers respectively. Furthermore, there's a related question about to what degree the language that I use to perform that categorization has any metaphysical impact on either the particular or the universal. Now, I know for my philosophy folks out there, that's going to sound a bit odd. For my magic people out there, it won't sound odd at all. Perhaps even absurd, honestly, but it's going to matter a good bit in just a little bit when we get to discussions, again, of magic. But what we have between Plato and Aristotle are basically the two dominant answers to how to deal with the question of universals. As I'm sure you all know, Plato famously answers that at least some universals are in fact metaphysically real. Those, of course, are the forms or the ideas of the Platonic philosophy. That is, Socrates and the number 3 are particularized as such because they participate, to use the Platonic language, in the eternal perfect forms of humanity or numericality or numberness, I suppose. For Plato, these forms were witnessed by our pre-carnate souls, largely forgotten when we got shoved into a body, when we got incarnated, and they're remembered as we come to learn new things. Thus, you actually don't learn geometry, but your soul remembers it as you study it in this life, as done in the Meno. So mathematical entities, and especially conceptual entities like goodness and justice and beauty, exist as general categories in a perfect eternal realm of being. We live in the realm of becoming, which human beings interact through the organ, as it were, of their souls. For Plato, the soul is an organ of perception, specifically perception of the forms. For his part, Aristotle thought that the Platonic forms were nonsense and that universal categories were simply conventional names for sets of things for which the term is used in an equivocal manner to discuss. That Socrates is a human or that 3 is a number doesn't for Aristotle imply the existence of those categories outside of their linguistic or logical use. They're just conventions for how we put stuff inside of linguistic boxes or sets, so to speak. And to a large degree, these two positions set the typologies of how to deal with the problem of universals down to this day. Plato's position is that some abstract objects have their own independent existence, and those categories are in fact real entities, just as real as you or I, perhaps even more real than you or I. This position is known as realism, and those entities are variably said to exist in their own realm, in the mind of God, or in what we might call moderate realism, as found in folks like Duns Scotus. They actually exist as sort of concepts within the human mind, but they're still in there and they're still real. On the other hand, nominalism is the position that universal categories or abstract objects like numbers exist in name only, from the Latin nomen, nominalism. Categories universal and mathematical objects are simply conventions of language and logic by which we communicate ideas or perform mathematical and logical functions. Further, both Aristotle and Plato were more or less conventionalists when it came to the philosophy of language, which is just to say that they held that language was basically of no intrinsic metaphysical bearing on either the particulars or the universals that they discuss. Though Plato does sometimes seem to suggest that language has its origins in natural signs, which means they're not totally arbitrary in the way that modern Saussurean semiotics assumes the relation of sign and signifier to be arbitrary. Now, while I'm sure they were partial to Greek, I doubt that they thought of Greek as having any more metaphysical bearing on the entities spoken or written about in those languages. And again, I'm sure they thought Greek was better than other languages, although I think that many Greeks did have a preference to thinking that hieroglyphic writing down in Egypt did have some kind of inherent metaphysical power. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And for our purposes, it's worth noting that by the early European Middle Ages, they were just where the Middle Ages didn't really occur anywhere else, but it was Platonism that appeared to be the frontrunner for philosophical dominance. St. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, and Jonas Scotus Erigena, not to be confused with the later Duns Scotus, for the famous for the concept of the ontological univocity of being fame, were all much more in the camp of Plato and therefore something of the realist camp, typical thinking that the forms were literally thoughts and the perfect ideas of God's mind. Further, language itself was considered to be a kind of divine gift, linking human beings with God, being part of that whole we're created in the divine image business. However, that Platonic bend was not to last, with attacks starting with Abelard and the translation projects of Aristotle from Arabic, especially as those translations were shaded, as we might say, with the commentaries of Averroes. The 12th and 13th centuries saw a dramatic shift to nominalism. And while there were many moderate realist holdouts, scholastics like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus did hold on to a moderate form of realism, again with those categories existing really, but as mental objects primarily. William of Ockham, famed for his razor that everyone mischaracterizes and that he kind of didn't even invent. History is a strange thing this way. Henry of Ockham would lead a full frontal assault on the last vestiges of realism, with nominalism or terminism flowering after the mid-14th century. Platonic realism had basically been crushed if it ever had a chance to get off its feet in the Middle Ages. Now, of course, that didn't stop occult practitioners, who I'm sure didn't give a damn about what debates were going on among scholastics, because they were concerned with experimental results. Recall that the medieval term for these kind of medieval spells were experimenta, and not highly abstract, granular metaphysical arguments. And that's witnessed by dozens of magical manuals that proliferated through the Latin West during this period. But I would suggest that for an intellectually rich philosophy, for an intellectually rich occult philosophy to flourish, nominalist intellectual hegemony isn't exactly the most copacetic environment, especially if that nominalism trivializes the role of language in metaphysics, something virtually inimical to most theories of pre-modern magic. However, nominalism was about to get a black eye, and the occult philosophy was about to get a gale force wind in its sails. That wind in the sails took three forms to my mind. The first two have to do with the rediscovery and publication at the very heart of metaphysical realism. You guessed it, it's Plato, the return of the repressed, and his intellectual and spiritual inheritors, including Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and the whole gang. As you may know, with the exception of the Timaeus, Plato was basically unknown through the Latin Middle Ages. And while Plato's influence could be felt indirectly through strange mistranslations of texts like Plotinus that people thought was Aristotle, the philosopher himself and his works didn't have a direct impact because they just weren't there. However, through the mid-15th century, Marsilio Ficino would provide the Herculean service of rendering the Platonic corpus along with the works of scholars that we now refer to as the Neoplatonists. Now, it's hard to imagine a world in which, over the course of basically a decade or so, the work of the most foundational philosophers of all time to go from complete obscurity to basically instant accessibility. The printing press is invented at the same time they're doing all these translations. It's just impossible to overstate just how quickly and radically Ficino's translations transformed European intellectual and spiritual life forever. And among the many revolutions to come, metaphysical realism was back on the agenda in a dramatic way for the first time, really, in basically 500 years up to this point. Secondly, and also indirectly thanks to our man Ficino again, was the arrival of the Corpus Hermeticum. Important for what was believed about it, perhaps even more than what was taught in it, especially in the translation that Ficino kinda did. The Hermetica promised to be the recovery of profoundly ancient, even primeval wisdom. At this time, the pervasive belief was that ancient wisdom was nearer to the divine source of all knowledge and was therefore more pure and more true. The Corpus Hermeticum was thought to be the teachings, of course, of the ancient Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, sometimes heralded as the teacher of Moses himself. sometimes heralded as that on the floor of mosaics in churches. The Prisca Theologia proved decisive over and against scholastic philosophy because insofar as this ancient wisdom was simply nearer to the divine truth, it could simply undermine the entire scholastic corpus wholesale. It didn't even need to make an argument, it was just ancienter and truer. And that's precisely what began to happen. An open assault on what Renaissance humanists and esotericists took to be a stolid, metaphysically meaninglessly obscure scholastic philosophy. It was Gothic in the bad sense. The followers of Duns Scotus became the Duns men, and they became reduced to dunces, hence the origin of that term. Of course, Hermetic ideas such as the semi-divine nature of the human being, the macro-microcosm relation, and an overall warming to theurgical and magical practices would also begin to transform European spiritual and intellectual life. Finally, metaphysical realism would get an unlikely boost from our buddies over there in Kabbalah. Primarily developed in the 13th century there in Spain and France, though inheriting incredibly important texts like the Sefer Yetzirah from late antiquity, Kabbalah would adopt a radical type of indigenous Jewish realism. For the Kabbalists, reality itself was forged through divine speech, and thus the Hebrew language was no mere convention. It was a sacred language, Lashon Kodesh. Recall the Torah had God speaking creation into being, and texts like the Sefer Yetzirah expound upon and really systematize this notion into both a cosmogenic theory, but also a magical practice. Think golem production. Further, thought and language are bound up with divine activity in the minds of Kabbalists, such that the human mind is said to commune with the divine mind through super-rational prophetic intercourse performed at some level in Hebrew and through Hebrew. That's the Abalathia piece. However, for the first few centuries of its development, the Kabbalah was a highly esoteric literature and practice known only to a very tiny group of rabbinical elites. Its impact on the larger arc of European intellectual or spiritual life was therefore marginal, if it had any impact whatsoever. That would also start to change beginning at exactly this time period in the mid-15th century, the exact same time period that Platonism and Hermeticism were also re-emerging, and it would be Ficino's younger colleague, Pico della Mirandola, who would spearhead the introduction of Kabbalah into the wider European intellectual and spiritual landscape. He did this by employing several converted Jews. Pico would orchestrate translations of several key Kabbalistic texts, arguing that the Kabbalah too contained primeval truths again, the knowledge of which was necessary to restore the proper dignitas to the human being. So much so that magic and Kabbalah were the best proofs of the truth of Christianity over and against the dominant scholastic paradigm and the scholastic philosophy. In fact, Pico argued that through magic and Kabbalah alone was it possible for humans to become truly exalted, transforming themselves into something virtually angelic in character. Though that typically gets just ignored when Pico's oration on the dignity of man is actually taught in contemporary university settings. It's one of the only texts of this tradition taught, and it gets mangled. It's a kind of real intellectual dishonesty when the text is taught with the magic and the Kabbalah basically amputated because of some strange, irrational Enlightenment, rationalism-infused revisionism. And while I'm very pro-Enlightenment, I love the Enlightenment, I'm a no on just straight up censorship of the intellectual history. And no, the magic and the Kabbalah weren't incidental for Pico's oration. They were absolutely central, making the grift of leaving it out all the more vicious. So, in a sense, by the start of the 15th century, some form of nominalism was the dominant answer to the problem of universals with a largely conventionalist theory of language. Then, within the span of just about a generation, The Platonic corpus, including Neoplatonism, the Prisca Theologia in the form of the Corpus Hermeticum, and the rise of Kabbalah in the form of Christian Kabbalah, had united into what would become the foundations of modern Western esotericism and a absolute spear against nominalism, which was triumphant only decades earlier. Nominalism was now facing a profound intellectual existential crisis, and the effects were immediate. Ficino's magical practice adopted a great chain of being model rather than the one in which the sublunar world is fundamentally distinct from the world of the celestial realm, thus linking the human being with the divine in a way that was almost blasphemous in the world of scholastic thinking, which embraced a hardcore Aristotelian world. The great chain of being broke that world. Pico introduced a neo-Pythagorean conception of formal numbers, thus making at least those abstract objects ontologically real rather than a mere counting convention or the numbers of the merchants as he had it. Of course, Kabbalistic speculation introduces the idea of Hebrew as a kind of divine Ursprach, which also has inherent metaphysical power. Hence, you're constantly seeing all that Hebrew, often very badly spelled, in all those textbooks of magic, though most famously, of course, in Agrippa. Speaking of Hebrew, Reuchlin would argue for the thaumaturgical power of Hebrew, specifically in the use of the tetragrammaton infused with a shin, transforming Yod He Vav He into a spelling of the name Yeshua, Jesus, of course, a name that he thought through which true miracles, magic, could be wrought. Hermetic ideas would flood into the intellectual landscape of this period, with Ludovico Lazzarelli for the first time declaring himself a Hermeticist and a Christian in 1505, the first time in history that we know of where someone used the language of Hermeticist to identify themselves. Of course, Agrippa would publish his Summa of Magic and Hermetic Philosophy in 1533, representing a fully fleshed out system of occult philosophy, a kind of occult summa, linking natural, celestial, and divine magic and mysticism together into one system of restoring the divinity with man. In a sense, the three books of occult philosophy was a hermetic, kabbalistic, and magical response to scholasticism. It was the Summa Magica in a way that Thomas's Summa Theologica represented the high point, in some sense, of medieval theology. Agrippa's 1533 represented the high watermark, in some sense, of the emergent Hermetic theology. Perhaps one of the most shocking, even frankly absurd forms of what we might call hyper-realism to emerge from this period would be John Dee's 1564 Monas Hieroglyphica. In that text, once called the most obscure book ever written by an Englishman, I wrote a master's thesis on it. I agree. Dee argues that reality can be understood and even transformed by a single powerful symbol, an astrological alchemical hieroglyph. Dee argues, as much as it can be called an argument, that geometry, not Hebrew, is the ontological fundamental, and that the glyph he develops or discovers is able to both capture and manipulate reality more so than any language, including Hebrew. In fact, he calls the manipulation of the hieroglyphic monad the Kabbalah of the real, as opposed to just the Kabbalah of what is merely spoken. In Dee's thinking, at least in that 1564 text, he has radically flattened semiotics and ontology into a metaphysical realism in which the categories and their particulars are collapsed into one symbol for reality, such that reality just is that symbol. This even allows Dee to claim that astrological and alchemical experimentation, they can be foregone for manipulation of the Monas Hieroglyphica, and how language and mathematics are derived from the monad and the role the symbol will play in the general reform of the whole world. All of it. Now, these claims are grandiose, even a bit absurd if we're going to be honest, but it just goes to show how far metaphysical realists were willing to push this form of thinking. It's clear that in less than 100 years since the printing of the Corpus Hermeticum in 1471, realism was reaching a kind of fever pitch. In fact, Dee would push it even further. Famously, his conversations with angels would reveal the very speech of God used to conjure creation itself, and which would bring about the apocalypse. With the Enochian language, we again have a full collapse between linguistics and metaphysics, semiotics, and ontology. Now, if many of these names and books I'm discussing are unfamiliar to you, that's that's normal. This channel is called Esoterica for a reason, or if you just need a refresher. But I've covered many of these texts and thinkers in other episodes, and I'll leave some of the links to those if you want to go flesh out some of these ideas in more depth. So go check the comment out and the links in the description to take a look at those episodes. But the point I want to drive home here is that the rise of the Renaissance philosophy, the rise of Renaissance occultism and early modern esoteric philosophy, it did not occur in an intellectual vacuum, and that it's crucial to situate it in that larger intellectual and philosophical context if we're really going to make sense of it, which is already pretty hard to begin with. Otherwise, it's just an already obscure philosophy and often intentionally made more difficult. Well, it just becomes completely incomprehensible. But oddly, it's often precisely this context that is ignored by practitioners, and it's only the context that's studied by mainstream philosophy. One gets only the one and one gets only the context. And for me, neither of those situations are intellectually or philosophically adequate if we're going to study this material carefully. So, Realism won, right? The Great Hermetic Revolution. No, it didn't. Both realism and nominalism would both face a new threat in the form of the emergent rationalism and empiricism of the 17th century. Further, more accurate dating of the Corpus Hermeticum would derail its claim to being primeval wisdom. It was dated to the 2nd or 3rd centuries. However, the Realist Revolution brought on by Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and Platonism would forever make its mark known in the history of philosophy and esoteric schools of thought. Were all here to stay. They survived in Paracelsus and Theosophy and Rosicrucianism, and of course the rise of initiatory societies. Nominalism would also continue, and while modern philosophy courses teach it, like rationalism and empiricism, just, put everything on the track to Kant, there were philosophers like Suarez and other scholastic philosophers that just kept on keeping on. Thomism is alive and well, if, marginalized over there in Catholicistan, but it's still out there at Notre Dame somewhere. So even scholasticism has, in some sense, survived just as much as the occult philosophy, both ultimately rather sidelined. So what about realism these days, like in academic philosophy? You think that given the rise of modern linguistics and semiotics, where the orthodoxy there is that the relationship of sign and signifier is arbitrary, that this would be the kingdom of the nominalists. But the story is actually a bit more complicated. In the most recent 2020 Phil Paper survey, where philosophers get to state their positions on various philosophical matters, and they get to do so anonymously, where they might tell the truth, the survey found that when asked about the ontology of abstract objects, about 39% accept or lean towards realism. A close second, 37%, lean towards nominalism, and 23% landed on the deeply philosophical position of other. Yeah, realism is just ever so slightly in the lead, a result that honestly I found to be pretty shocking. Now, of course, I think that some of that is probably mathematical realism specifically, that mathematical entities are real, but one must wonder if the Hermetic Revolution of the 15th century had never occurred, would it just be like 80% nominalism triumphant? I don't know, but that's worth considering. Regardless, the rise of the occult philosophy is a fascinating and important moment in the development of Western intellectual and spiritual life. And I'd insist that it deserves to be understood as an important part of our philosophical development as well, and it should be studied and taught as such. And with this brief analysis of the philosophical problems of universal and the relationship of language to metaphysics, we can see, I think, pretty clearly that it's played an absolutely decisive role, shifting the conversation from the dominance of scholastic nominalism in the 14th century to something much more rich and complex by the mid-16th century, and thus at the very birth of modernity. That's no small thing, and it should be appreciated as part of the history of philosophy. Now, I'll be coming back for more episodes exploring how esotericism and philosophy and occultism all interacted, influenced, and transformed the history of philosophy in future episodes. So make sure to stick around. More about the relationship of philosophy and the occult as we think more about it here on the channel. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you. Thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.